Western military presence in Africa is disappearing faster than most people realize. France withdrew its last troops from Senegal in July 2025, ending over 60 years of permanent bases in West Africa. Chad kicked them out in November 2024. Ivory Coast handed back their last base in February 2025. By early 2026, France has 0 permanent military bases left in West or Central Africa except Djibouti. And everywhere they left, Russia has been quietly moving in. What makes this alarming isn't that Russia is sending massive armies or outspending the West. They're doing something more effective than that. They're turning security crises and frustration with Western governments into long-term political influence, and they're doing it without ever directly fighting Western forces. Here's how we got here. For decades, Western military presence in the Sahel worked on a pretty simple model. France kept counterterrorism forces in their former colonies. The United States ran training missions and drone bases through AFRICOM. Both countries required things in exchange. They wanted progress on democracy. They wanted human rights protections. They wanted anti-corruption reforms and clear timelines for elections. That worked fine as long as African governments had no other options. That model collapsed starting in 2020. Military officers in Mali launched a coup. Then another one in 2021. Burkina Faso had 2 coups in 2022 alone. Niger had one in July 2023. These weren't ideological revolutions. They were security revolts by officers who'd spent years fighting jihadist insurgencies while watching French forces fail to stop the violence. Every time they wanted to delay elections because of security problems, Western governments threatened sanctions. These new military leaders all reached the same conclusion. Western security partnerships weren't delivering actual security, and Western political demands had become constraints they didn't want anymore. So Mali expelled French forces in August 2022. Burkina Faso did it in February 2023. Niger followed in December 2023. Then even Chad, one of France's most reliable partners, ended their defense agreement in November 2024. Senegal, which is a democracy that never had a coup, announced they'd end French military presence by the end of 2025. Think about that timeline. In 3 years, France went from multiple bases across the Sahel to having none in the entire region. ECOWAS, the regional bloc Western governments counted on for pressure, lost all its leverage when Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger withdrew completely in January 2025. The United States shut down most USAID programs and closed the Global Engagement Center. The 2025 US National Security Strategy gave Africa less than 1 page. Russia didn't push anyone out. They walked into a region where Western influence had already fallen apart and governments were actively looking for alternatives. The key difference is what Russia offers. When Western countries provide security assistance, it comes with conditions. You need to make progress on democracy. You need to protect human rights. You need to fight corruption. You need electoral timelines. Russia offers security assistance with no political conditions whatsoever. Your government is fighting an insurgency and needs help. Russia doesn't require you to promise elections. Consolidating power? Russia doesn't lecture you about civilian rule. Russia doesn't publicly criticize how you govern, and they don't threaten sanctions when you delay transitions. The Wagner Group entered Mali in December 2021 at the junta's request. They operated alongside Malian forces, providing training, equipment, and direct combat support without ever conditioning that support on governance reforms. When Wagner's leader Yevgeny Prigozhin died in August 2023 after his mutiny, Western analysts predicted Wagner's Africa operations would collapse. Instead, Russia reorganized everything. Wagner got rebranded and partially replaced by the Africa Corps, which is supervised by Russian military intelligence. About 70 to 80% of the personnel were the same Wagner veterans who just stayed in place. By early 2025, the Africa Corps was operating in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Central African Republic, and expanding elsewhere. In June 2025, Wagner announced their Mali mission was complete and Africa Corps took over everything. This transition matters because it shifts from informal mercenary operations to centralized state control. Wagner operated in a gray zone where Russia could deny involvement. Africa Corps operates under Russian military intelligence, making it a clear extension of state policy. That makes the strategy more durable and harder to disrupt. Russia didn't keep these relationships bilateral either. In September 2023, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense pact among the three military governments. Russia saw this as a major opportunity. Instead of negotiating with each country separately, they started engaging all three as a single bloc. In September 2024, all three countries signed a joint deal with Roscosmos for surveillance satellites and secure communications. Rosatom discussed nuclear energy cooperation with all three. In April 2025, their foreign ministers traveled to Moscow together. And Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov announced that Russian military forces would support a new joint force for the alliance. Russia established a formal dialogue mechanism at the foreign minister level specifically for these three countries. In July 2025, a Russian defense delegation visited all three to discuss expanding Africa Corps presence. In December 2025, Russia hosted a major Africa Partnership Forum conference in Cairo, with over 50 African nations attending. What Russia understands is that their strategy can't just be about deploying troops. They're building institutional relationships that outlast individual deployments. The Alliance of Sahel States gives Russia a regional bloc that coordinates positions and shares security frameworks. If that alliance grows, Russia's influence grows without needing to send more troops or spend more money. Military cooperation is only half the strategy. Russia has invested heavily in media infrastructure across Africa. By the end of 2025, they'd opened 22 Russia House cultural centers across the continent. Russia opened new embassies in Niger and South Sudan in 2025, with 5 more planned for Comoros, Gambia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Togo. Some of these countries never even had Soviet embassies during the Cold War. Russian state media operates throughout Africa, providing alternatives to Western reporting. The messaging stays consistent everywhere. Western powers exploited Africa during colonialism and still interfere through conditions and sanctions. Russia offers partnership without interference. African nations have the right to choose their partners and govern without external pressure. This messaging works because it connects to real grievances. France really did maintain military bases in former colonies for 60 years. Western institutions really did attach conditions to aid and loans. Western governments really did threaten sanctions against coup governments. Russia didn't invent these complaints. They amplified existing frustrations and positioned themselves as the alternative. In July 2024, Wagner forces in Mali suffered a devastating ambush at Tinzaoui-10 that killed dozens of fighters. Western analysts predicted this would turn public opinion against Russia. Instead, Malian authorities framed the attack as proof that external enemies were trying to sabotage Mali's sovereignty. Russian involvement continued without interruption. So why does this alarm Western governments? Russia is systematically eroding Western leverage without direct confrontation. For decades, Western countries had leverage in Africa because they controlled access to everything governments needed. Security assistance, development aid, diplomatic backing, integration into Western-led institutions. Russia's model breaks that leverage. Governments no longer need Western security assistance because Russia provides an alternative with no political conditions. They don't need IMF loans because Russia offers resource-backed financing without governance requirements. They don't need Western diplomatic backing because Russia recognizes them regardless of how they came to power. Russia doesn't have to replace Western influence entirely. Making it optional instead of necessary is enough. Optional influence is weak influence. The sanctions system only works when target countries have limited alternatives. Western sanctions are effective because most countries need access to Western markets and financial systems enough to comply. But if Russia offers an alternative that bypasses Western systems, sanctions become less effective. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger all face Western sanctions. None have changed their policies. They've deepened ties with Russia instead. When Niger had a coup in July 2023, ECOWAS threatened military intervention. France backed that position. But Mali and Burkina Faso announced they'd consider intervention against Niger, an act of war against them. ECOWAS backed down. In January 2025, all 3 countries withdrew from ECOWAS entirely. The security vacuum France left behind is real. Jihadist violence in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger has increased since Russian forces arrived. Africa Corps hasn't stopped the insurgencies. Russian forces have been accused of human rights abuses, including attacks on civilians. But from these military governments' perspective, That's not the relevant metric. What matters is whether Russian partnership lets them govern without Western pressure. On that measure, it's working. Russia's engagement also undermines regional unity. Algeria traditionally played a mediating role in Sahel disputes. Russia's direct relationships with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have sidelined Algeria completely. When diplomatic crises emerged between Algeria and Mali in 2025, Russia stayed passive instead of mediating. Russia benefits from fragmentation. Weaker regional institutions mean less collective resistance. The long-term concern is that this model spreads. If the alliance of Sahel states looks like a successful alternative, other countries might follow. Senegal and Ivory Coast already reduced French military presence. What if they explore Russian security cooperation? What if coastal West African states facing spillover violence decide they need alternative partners? Russia's Africa engagement also supports their global strategy. Russia uses African countries to evade sanctions, launder money, and recruit personnel. Reports indicate Russia has tried recruiting African nationals to fight in Ukraine. Russian operations serve intelligence purposes, monitoring Western activities and building networks. The naval base Russia planned in Port Sudan would have given them Red Sea access and projection into the Middle East and Indian Ocean. Russia's presence concentrates in a few countries. Their trade and investment remain limited. AFRICOM hasn't delivered decisive military victories. Russian partnerships haven't stopped jihadist violence or stabilized the Sahel. Many African governments stay aligned with the West or maintain balanced relationships. Russia might be overextended. The war in Ukraine consumes enormous resources. Syria's Assad regime collapsed in December 2025, threatening Russia's Tartus naval base, which was crucial for supplying Africa operations. But the trend matters. In 2020, France had multiple Sahel bases, ECOWAS had cohesion, and Western partnerships were the default. In 2026, France has no permanent bases in West or Central Africa outside Djibouti. 3 Sahel countries withdrew from ECOWAS and formed a Russian-backed alliance, and Western conditionality gets rejected increasingly. That shift happened in 5 years. There are 3 realistic scenarios. First, Russia consolidates in the Sahel and expands cautiously. AFRICOM stabilizes at 8 to 10 countries with 12 to 15,000 personnel. Russia signs military agreements with over 35 African nations. The alliance adds members. Russia establishes naval facilities beyond Sudan. This represents steady growth building on existing relationships. Second, Russia maintains current presence without significant growth. AFRICOM consolidates in Sudan, Central African Republic, Libya, and Mali with 5 to 6,000 personnel, focusing on protecting existing resource interests. The Sudan naval base becomes operational by 2027, but no additional facilities get built. This assumes Russia prioritizes Ukraine and limits African commitments. Third, Russia contracts significantly. AFRICOM pulls back from Mali and Libya, focusing on Sudan and Central African Republic. Personnel drops to 2 to 3,000. The Sudan naval base gets postponed. Arms sales decline. This requires severe economic crisis in Russia or major Ukraine setbacks. The most likely scenario falls between the first and second. Russia consolidates where they already operate, deepens alliance relationships, and expands cautiously where governments are receptive. Russia doesn't need to win everywhere. They just need to prevent Western dominance. As long as governments in key countries can choose Russian partnership over Western conditionality, Western leverage stays weakened. Western responses have been limited. The Trump administration shows minimal interest in Africa. AFRICOM might avoid major cuts, but there's no expanded engagement. Europe faces constraints. Ukraine consumes attention and resources. France completed its withdrawal and repositioned toward limited, request-based partnerships. African governments make calculated decisions based on their interests. They're not choosing sides in global competition. They're choosing partners who offer what they need without imposing what they don't want. For coup governments consolidating power, that means security without election demands. For resource-rich countries, that means buyers without governance conditions. For countries frustrated with Western influence, that means alternatives acknowledging sovereignty. Russia recognizes this and tailors accordingly. They don't ask African governments to cut Western ties. They just offer options without the same constraints. Many governments maintain relationships with Western countries, Russia, and others simultaneously. They're not abandoning the West. They're reducing dependency. Geopolitical outcomes get decided in meeting rooms in Cairo, where 50 African foreign ministers coordinate with Russia. In military bases in Bamako, where Africa Corps advisors train local forces. In media studios in Ouagadougou, where narratives about sovereignty reach millions. Russia's Africa strategy won't be written about like major wars, but it's reshaping global power balance in ways that matter more than most battlefield victories.